of A League of Their Own, which I loved as much as I loved the first time I saw it. It's so good. I was telling the class that at Halloween I saw 3 girls dressed in A League of Our Own uniforms.
Yeah, we got there was a real Halloween movement.
Yeah.
Around the show and probably the movie too, but it was nice. It was I don't know how this is quantified, but Amazon told us it was the number 9 Halloween costume of the year.
Oh, okay.
I was like, there you go. Crack the top 10.
Did you have like a link in the show?
No.
Like,
no, we haven't gotten to
Amazon.
that stage of Amazon Prime Video yet where we have to put links into the...
It's happening.
I'm sure it probably is.
I always forget that about Amazon when I'm watching the shows, even though I'm watching it, on Amazon.
Yeah.
But it is comforting anyway. Amazon doesn't have to worry so much about the money from the television side of things because they're making money.
Yes.
Other places. And you've been there since the beginning, haven't you?
Yeah, no, I did a pilot for them in their first round of pilots, which is back when they were having people vote on them.
That.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's like impossible. Like when you describe the people voted on them, it just seems so weird. How many? And was that Alpha?
No, I did a pilot. So I worked for...
that was one of the early Prime shows.
Yes, it was. That was what I did right afterwards. I worked for a satirical news organization that some of you maybe have heard of called The Onion. And I started the web video part of The Onion. And then we did a show on Comedy Central, which was making shows at the time. They don't really do that anymore. Nope. And then I made a pilot for Amazon that was like a scripted, kind of like network. It was like behind the scenes of this imaginary, slightly terrifying news network. It was very fun to make. And it was at a time when people were like, Amazon is making TV shows.
Right.
And it was a really interesting process to watch.
Was that one of the first pilots?
It was. And it was...
What's it called?
It was called Onion News Empire. And it was like, they were like, we're going to do this democratically and we're going to have everyone vote on it. And then it was the highest rated pilot and they didn't do it.
I know.
Like, thank you for...
That was such bullshit.
Yeah, it was a marketing thing, but an interesting one. So...
Yeah, how long did it lasted? 3 years, maybe 3? I don't even think.
Yes, and then they sort of, I think at some point they were like, they kept not following the results.
Right. Yes.
Which is, they're right. It's their network. So they were kind of like, we should just slowly let this die.
Stop doing this. This is not American Idol.
Are you guys all, just so I know, is everyone here, you're studying television and film?
Most of them, yeah.
Mostly writers and directors? Or just a real mix of everything?
There's some music. Okay. And there's also, this is a cross curriculum. So there are also kids in here who aren't in the cinema school.
Great.
So, because television is cool. So
it is.
I'm so excited that you remember the Amazon pilots. As critics, it was really weird because you were like, are we supposed to review these pilots? Like, it was very strange.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk about A League of Their Own. So can you tell me the story of how you came to, as I mentioned to you earlier, I was talking about before we watched the show, about the differences, the similarities and the differences about how A League of Their Own, the movie, was supposed to be this huge breakthrough show, more female-centric movies, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't. And Gina Davis has had to fight and fight, and everybody's had to fight and fight to have more female-centric content. But also, the way this is very much not your father's A League of Their Own. I mean, when you open, you're dealing with all sorts of different storylines that are much more progressive, storylines that would not have played. Like, you would not have been able to have a gay storyline in A League of Their Own, not just because the audiences were potentially, or the producers were homophobic, but also because of the sports thing that, like, even women would be like, oh, so every athlete is gay, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how you came into this project, and then also how you went about adapting it for a different generation, basically.
Yeah. So I created the show with Abby Jacobson, who you just watched, who made a show called Broad City that maybe you guys have seen, and it is just one of the funniest, best people out there. And it started. How did it start? I was in Venice, Italy, shooting a show called Mozart in the Jungle, and it was like a very chaotic shoot where we had like rafts on the Grand Canal and like opera stars and Monica Bellucci and Wallace Shawn and Gael Garcia Bernal, and like everything was going wrong. So I had to like rewrite a whole episode in one night, and the hotel was incredibly loud. And I had grown up with the movie. I'm queer, and I think I was drawn to the movie for the. How many of you have seen the movie? Like, oh, it was very fun. There was like a Twitter with the fans of the show, a lot of whom are younger. There was like a Twitter like, we should go back and watch this movie and see what this is all about, from people who had watched the show. So it was really loud, and I put on the movie as like background noise to write against, which I sometimes do. And then I started watching it and thinking about the way we tell stories and retell stories, and probably what was going on underneath it. And I love history. I think if I wasn't a writer and director, I'd be a historian. I love old things and documents and letters. So I started just for fun, kind of going back through some of the historical archives. And what was immediately clear was that there was a huge story about women of color that wasn't told in the movie, or was barely told in the film. For people who've seen it, there's sort of one moment in which a black woman, who's roughly based on a woman named Mamie Johnson, who tried out for the AAG PBL, but then went on to play in the Negro Leagues. There's sort of one moment where she appears, and that was a huge story. That was completely unknown. And then you could kind of see the shape or the outline of these queer stories. There were sort of self-published memoirs on Amazon that had been discounted by everybody else. There were letters. It's a beautiful photo of a tombstone of two of the players who, if some of you have seen the Netflix documentary A Secret Love, that memorializes their relationship, and it says, Pat and Terry like in a league of their own. And I got really interested in that. And then I started doing deeper research.
So this was just on your own. You were just,
yeah.
It wasn't like anybody said, hey, would you be interested? And you were just like watching the movie. Okay.
Yeah, I was just, and then I went to Sony, who made the movie. And I was like, do you want to let me do a new version of this movie that really looks at the stories behind it, especially the stories of the queer community, which I had started to, in talking to some of the original players, realize was more massive than I ever could have imagined that it was. And I was like, there probably will be like, no. Because that's usually how it works. And instead they were like, yes. So I spent, and then I had dinner with Abby, who I knew from New York. And I was like, how when you're talking about doing something, you're like, oh yeah, it'll be great. It'll be easy. And then the moment someone's like, yes, do it, you're like, oh God. Like, what have I done to myself? So I had that moment, and then I had dinner with Abby, and I was like, oh God, like, what am I doing? And she plays softball. She'd also grown up on the movie. So we started to talk about it. She'd also just come out pretty recently at the time. And we met more and more of the original players, including a woman named Maybelle Blair, who's just one of the most life-changing people that I've ever met, who came out at the age of 95 at our premiere in June. And she's incredible, changed my life. And we asked her what it was like to find so many people who were like her. We were like, how many of the people were queer? And she was like, well, probably really queer, like, or she wouldn't say queer, but like really gay, like maybe like 65% of them. But there was like another 15% that were sort of gay for that period of time. And we were like, whoa. And she we were like, what was it like to find all these people? And she said, oh, it was a party. And I think just as a queer person, I thought about what that means to say that in the 1940s, in the middle of World War II, a very notoriously dark time in history. And that was in some way where the sort of thematic core of the show really took shape, I think, was that we were going to tell these stories through the lens of joy, and tell this kind of joyful story of a community, which you see the very start of in the pilot, but there's a lot more still to come.
Well, yeah, I mean, the joy is, I mean, even just that scene where they're all just running onto the field, just like kind of and I think, you know, when the movie came out, I mean, first of all, most people didn't know about the women's leagues.
Yeah.
So that was a huge revelation. But also, there just weren't a lot of movies that took women seriously as athletes, and but just the joy of the sport.
Mm-hmm.
That was, you know, I mean, there were the movies that were about female athletes, you know, they were either falling off a mountain or getting into some sort of trouble, and, you know.
Right, or it was sort of depicted as cute.
Right, something they were going to grow out of. So this was like kind of, and very wistful and very, you know, but so talk about like doing those stories, and then, you know, A League of Their Own, like really, I mean, it was obviously a baseball team, so there were a lot of women there, but it focused on like what, like maybe 3 narratives, 3 characters.
The movie?
Yeah, like the sisters and Madonna and Rosie. And like, and,
I mean, there's...
But with this, so how did you like sort of spread that out? Like,
well, I think the key thing to understand, and we thought a lot about sort of the right way of retelling this story, was we never really were trying to remake the movie.
Right.
In a sense, we were like, oh, there's a totally different story, kind of like an iceberg that's underneath the water, that has a lot in common with the movie. And we love Penny Marshall's film, and we love especially the tone of it. And it's that kind of film where you can imagine the like Oscar bait version of the story that would be like really pretentious, the way that we often tell story about firsts, but instead it was funny and unpretentious and very flawed characters. So we really went back to the original stories, and I think people don't realize it because the tone of the show is kind of loose, but an incredible amount of it is based on real research, real stories. We hung out with the sort of 60 or so remaining players from the league. And from the start, we also knew that it was going to be a show that was deeply intersectional, and that the lived experience reflected in it was going to be much bigger than any one person's perspective. So we kind of said from the start, like, we're really going to have to write this as a team in a different way than other shows do, because it's something that's easy to say about TV shows, but at the end of the day, you kind of have one showrunner who's making the calls most of the time. So we really dug into the real narratives underneath it, and we sort of let them unfold. And we knew that we wanted to keep joy at the center of the story without looking away from the hard things. And we knew that the structure of the show, which, as you start to see in the pilot, is very bifurcated for a lot of the season, and then not for some of it. The structure was just going to have to be whatever supported those stories the best. We weren't going to kind of bend the authenticity of the stories into the structure, even though it would have been easier to do that at some points. And I think we just started to like put photos, quotes, things up on the wall, and Abby and I started to write stuff, and gradually kind of the tone of the show came together.
So is I can't remember her name, the black character.
Yeah, Max.
Is she based on a real character, or is she a hopeful? I mean, No,
she's based on, so there's 3 women, Toni Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Johnson, who, Mamie Johnson in particular tried out for the AAG PBL and was sort of run off in a way that, with her friend Rita, very similar to what happens to Max and Clance in the pilot. She went on to play professionally in the Negro Leagues with men. as did Tony Stone, who came right before her, and Connie Morgan, who came a little bit afterwards. Interestingly, and I guess obviously in a way, there were also dozens of other women, Black women playing at the time who maybe didn't get quite as far, but were playing in industrial leagues in the factories. And it really is, it's a huge part of American history. It's a huge story. The story of the Negro Leagues is a huge story that the show kind of gets closer to in season 1 that people don't know in the same way that they didn't know the story of the AGPBL before the movie.
Did you, I mean, how far out did you map it? Do you like have season 2? Do you have?
Yes.
And season 3?
Yes.
And
well, I think what's interesting about this show is kind of like there's certain shows, and I've never worked on a show exactly like this, even though I just did another period piece called Daisy Jones and the Six for Amazon too, which hasn't come out yet. But this is a story about like generational change in a way that like I looked at Mad Men as an example. So it's starting in the middle of World War II, right? And in this moment in time that was really interesting when all the rules changed and suddenly all of these things were possible for women that hadn't been possible. And afforded people the opportunity to have these kind of queer communities that they hadn't had before. And you actually see that across American society at the time in the Army. There's huge coming out narratives that came out of the military, different parts. So it's a story that is sort of about the rules being suspended and people like Mamie Johnson and some of the players in the AGPBL were very conscious that this was a moment in time that wasn't going to last. So they had to get where they were going before the rules came back. And then the rules came back. And ultimately, the league lasted longer than that. The war ended in 45. The league lasted until 52. So it's a generational story in a lot of ways, and there's a couple different chapters to it. So that sort of provided a structure for the series, not necessarily for every single one of the characters, but that's grown out of our writing process.
So do you plan to follow them past the baseball leagues, or you're just going to keep it within when they're playing?
I think we're going to keep it within them playing, but what that means and how it's happening is going to change a lot.
Right.
And that's part of what's exciting about the show is it takes you through the factories and sort of gives you a different look at what the narratives around women working in the factories were at the time, and takes you inside of like a queer bar in the 1940s that is based on a real bar that we went to in Rockford that's still there. And it takes you some places that hopefully you haven't seen as much of on screen before, but does it in a tone and in an approach that is saying this is a great American story, which it is, and it happens to be focused on women and queer people and people of color.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it does explain how the 50s happened.
Yes.
It's like when everybody came home and everybody's like, no, we got to clamp down. But the seeds had been sown.
Yeah,
so.
get back.
Yeah, get back.
Inside,
Yes.
And there was also a narrative for queer people who are here might find it interesting. There was in addition to in the league, there was sort of this worry that playing baseball was going to make these women into lesbians.
Right. That's what
that also happened in factories. It happened in the WAC, the Women's Army Corps. The idea that sort of women working in groups were inherently
and
suspect.
wearing slacks.
Yes. Yeah, pants are dangerous.
No, that's interesting. But what I was saying before is like when the movie came out, there was a cultural narrative that pushed back against, that by saying that women athletes, they're all straight, which of course they weren't. And when, Martina Navratilova came out, that was like the beginning of the real, exposure. But it's like, so the movie was trying to do something while also trying to not do something.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, and I think it's been very interesting. The show was trolled. I think we had, for a lot of reasons, a very visible launch. including some of them that we didn't intend. The show was trolled pretty hard. There was a lot of like, you're taking our American story and making it woke and that kind of thing. And, we tried to just reinforce like, no, these are real stories, but I think it can be disorienting for audiences. We're used to seeing especially queer characters in the sort of like fourth person on the call sheet kind of role who has like a story, but it's not that big of a story. Both main characters in this show are queer, and about half of the main cast in general is. And when we won an award from the Human Rights Campaign a couple of weeks ago for visibility, and they gave us all the numbers, they were like, oh, this show is responsible for 9% of the queer representation on television as a whole. Wow. And you're just like, wow. That is
not great.
Depressing. But I think it can be disorienting for people to have both of their POV characters be queer. And it was very interesting listening to some people who were like, well, come on, this is a story about women. And we were like, they are women. Those things aren't in conflict with each other. So, yeah, it's been interesting to see the reactions.
Right. No, I mean, you're absolutely right about the second on the call sheet. Although I think also what's not disorienting, I would say striking, is that we do see a lot more queer and, all sorts of characters in young contemporary shows. Mm-hmm. But this is like saying, this is your grandma. This is, these are your, like, queerness wasn't invented in the 2000s.
And neither was, I think, especially, I had never met a 90-year-old queer person when I started working on this, and now I like text with a bunch of them, and am friends with a lot of them. And it really, for me, I mean, was life-changing, has been life-changing, continues to be in a lot of ways. But one of those ways was just sort of, I think we have narratives that sort of queer joy and community evolved post-Stonewall.
Right.
And the fact, of course, that's not true. And you realize that when you think about it. But it really made me realize you're sort of part of a long tradition of people who in different ways have had to make their lives around a society that just wasn't shaped for them, and have found ways of doing that. And this is a show that I think a lot of times when we tell the stories of people from historically marginalized groups in history, we tend to tell the sort of exceptional stories, like the person who invented something and then, had to go to jail or something horrible happened to them. It was really fun and amazing to get to explore the stories of more or less normal people, right. Working class people, right. And kind of look at those joyful stories through those lenses.
So when you were casting the show, were you looking for athletes? Were you looking for baseball players? Were you looking for...
And Penny Marshall famously had sort of said, there's stories from the making of the movie where she said, like, basically you have to play baseball or you can't try out. And so all the actresses at the time kind of ran into each other at the batting cages because they were... So we did something similar, and then we wound up casting one or two people who were a little bit less skilled. Kate Berlant, who's in the show, I think it's okay that she probably won't kill me for saying that, who's a comedic genius. There was like a moment where I walked by our baseball coordinator is a woman named Justine Siegel, who was the first woman to coach for a major league team. And I walked by her and Kate in the stands, and Kate was saying, like, so when they go all the way around, that's a run. And I was like, oh, boy.
Oh, no.
But most of the cast, including Abby, were pretty anywhere from somewhat to very experienced players.
Right. Right. I mean, because I think it's really important, because we still, my daughter plays soccer, and we always talk about bend it like Beckham, and it was like Keira Knightley has never been a soccer player, and it's like it is kind of insulting. So it's like these women all look like or most of them look like they actually play.
Yes. And famously, also the exception in the movie was Gina Davis, who was cast 2 weeks beforehand and missed the 3 months of training camp that they did. And when we spoke to Penny Marshall before she passed away, and she was like, we just made her the catcher. You just say she's great. She sits there. She's great.
She had some good bats. She had some good at bats.
Yeah, no, and that's sort of the.
So, did you have a training program? You had did they have to have a spring training? For
yeah, so they did about a week and a half of training before the pilot, which you just watched, and then they did probably 3 months of training on and off in LA, and then in Pittsburgh where we shot the show before we filmed it, which was really fun. And it also meant, I mean, one of the things that you kind of don't think about when you're making TV, but it's a big thing is rehearsal time is expensive. And so, especially for an ensemble show, a lot of times people are kind of meeting the day before you shoot. And then it's we've been friends for years. We're a team. And in this case, they spent so much time with each other that almost the problem when we were shooting this was we had to be you guys just met. You have to walk it back a little bit. But it really helped the sort of team dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And in the pilot, I noticed there was a scene where there were a couple of older ladies. Were they original?
Yeah, so that's Maybelle Blair, who's 95, who, like I said, came out a few months ago, and Shirley Berkovich, who is her best friend, who passed away right before the show came out. But they're both legends, incredible athletes, and Maybelle still travels the country all the time, just doing events to promote women playing baseball and women in sports.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. We need to get the microphone. Sorry.
Hi. I'm Ian. Thanks for coming. I very much enjoyed that. I loved the movie when I saw it, so this was really nice to see a new version of it. I'm curious. So Abby also was kind of splitting because she's acting in it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
How did she manage that? Just curious.
She's super talented and great, and I think also that's all she knows. Really, because that's how Broad City, we became friends at the time when she was doing the Broad City web series, and she's always been in everything that she's written. So she's used to it, but it's incredibly challenging. And when you look at people who do what she does, it takes just a level of mental stamina that I think is really intense. There are also interestingly, and I don't know if any of you guys also perform in your work, but there are moments where she sort of had to be I can't be part of making this production decision right now or deciding if we keep this scene or we don't, because I'm sort of too in it on a personal level. And I was great, no problem. We'll take care of it. So it's a really interesting thing to watch, and it also really shaped our kind of partnership.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay, hello.
Hi.
So my question is, was there a reason, either from a marketing standpoint or a creative standpoint, why you decided to name it A League of Their Own instead of A League of Their Own : or just something completely different?
I have to say, I've never thought about that. So I think the answer is no. I mean, I think we could have named it something completely different, right? And the truth is, that wouldn't have felt we never would have made the show in this way without the movie. And if you watch the show and you're familiar with the movie, there's tons of sort of love letters in it and references. And at the same time, we were really looking at the stories underneath it. And it's scary when you're working on something this beloved and you're actually doing something a little different. There are definitely times where I'm like, I wish this show was named something else so that it would just be looked at on its own terms. And it definitely, we were nervous. Luckily, the show got like really good reviews, but like I was very nervous in the couple of days before the show came out. But yeah, I think it's also if you watch the whole show, it's a title that has very different resonance for the show than it does for the movie. The show's about teams on multiple levels, like kind of the team that you play sports with, but also the kind of community, the league that you find of people who are like you, and those things overlap, but they're not the same. So we thought a lot about sort of the resonance of those words for the show.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Axel. I really loved the scene where Carson was writing the letter, and her friends walked in, and she had to say, like, she was pondering war. And it occurred to me, you always hear about all the industrious things women did while the men were away at war, but I think it's really funny to think about the ways sometimes they kind of just, like, realistically, people aren't always going to be really morbid and serious about the war if it's that far away. And I was curious about your research and just in general, if you found any evidence of women kind of just having fun and not taking the war too seriously. I think that's just very funny.
Yeah. No, I think so a couple different answers to that. In terms of our research, we did about three years of research from the time that we started working on the show to the time that we started making it. And this isn't the kind of research that's collected in a book that you can just read. We sort of had to do it ourselves and talk to people, and people remember things differently. And it was a really interesting experience. One of the things that was challenging and kind of funny about it is part of what you're saying, where they're like, it was the best time of our lives. Like, I've never felt more alive. I was so happy. And we were like drinking and sneaking out and having fun and going to bars and like making out with each other. And then you're like, and it was World War II. And they're like, yeah. And like in the marketing of the league, which you see a little bit here, they were kind of like, this is a patriotic thing that these women are doing, keeping baseball going. The women definitely didn't see it that way. They were like, we got to play baseball. It was awesome. To me, part of what I took from that in terms of sort of shaping the themes of the show, because especially when you're making a period piece, you sort of have one thought process that's about the authenticity of the story that you're telling, and another thought process that's about now and the audience and how they relate to it. We have been living through a time that's like fairly unstable, I would say, where you don't always know what's going to happen in the next few months. And the idea that you can find joy in the middle of that, and you can have fun, and people got drunk and did weird things and broke their lives, but it wound up working out for them, even when things are chaotic and when they seem dark and where you don't necessarily know where things are going. That meant a lot to me. And it's something we really purposefully tried to emphasize in the show.
Thank you.
For women, it was like the freedom.
Yeah.
And to have economic independence and they were able to do things that they were literally legally not allowed to do before.
Absolutely. And by the way, a really interesting part of that is that women were making wildly more money than, especially a lot of the black women who worked in factories, and there were tons of them were coming from jobs in other people's homes. And in some cases, we're making 6 or 7 times the salary. And that created whole new economies, but it also meant that people could do things that they hadn't done before, and that also meant having fun, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize. Also, the women playing in the AAGPPL were paid sort of $70 a week, which was a huge salary at the time. And
Especially since they were getting room and board.
yes, but legally they also weren't allowed to have their own bank accounts. So it was like an interesting set of contradictions.
More questions?
Me. I'm Kai, and I was just curious if you have any queer films or queer television shows or queer directors or showrunners that you've really looked up to throughout your life, and if they've played any role in your work.
Yeah, I have so many. And funnily enough, Jamie Babbitt, who directed our pilot, directed a movie called But I'm a Cheerleader.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I do too. And it's kind of like an iconic queer classic that now Jamie's one of my best friends. But when I met her, I was like, hi, so nice to meet you. I'm kind of nervous. Yeah, I love queer filmmaking and queer filmmakers, and looking at the history of queer cinema, you see people who've been able to tell their stories more directly. And then also when you look back at the 40s, for example, you see people who had to tell their stories allegorically. So we have an entire episode that we did, the 6th episode of the series, that sort of focused on the Wizard of Oz. Which is an example of a queer cinematic narrative that was sort of very strongly encoded. So I spent a lot of time looking at those. Yeah, I mean, almost all, not all, that's not true. So many of the filmmakers that I admire are queer, and I'm non-binary, and I think sort of looking at gender in that kind of way, and learning to kind of just see, even in comedy, how gender is represented in ways that you don't necessarily think about. It's been amazing. But also, I think as I've kind of come up and become a showrunner, and now I have a deal at Amazon, and I have a company, and we're producing a bunch of stuff, making things that put historically marginalized groups and queer people among them at the center is also really challenging. For all the reasons that we know about the industry. So I now have a community of queer showrunners that I really depend on for advice about things like marketing, and you know, how to deal with networks and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, for those of you that are studying film, it's never too early to think about your community. Like, you come up together. And I still work with a lot of people I went to college with. Like, it's you have to find your people.
Thank you. Also, I just want to say I love the show. I've only seen this episode, but I will continue watching, and I just love the whole cast and everything about it.
I'm so glad that you liked it, and reach out to me. I'm on Twitter for as long as Twitter exists. We'll see. And let me know what you think when you watch the rest. It goes a lot of places that people don't necessarily expect at the start. I'm also happy to answer questions about anything, just industry stuff, anything else, if there's anything on people's minds.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jared. My question is, and preface this, so I've only seen the pilot so far. I think typically in shows, like especially one in like romantic relationships and also in like sexuality, like things are normally built up and tension and things for the audience, and normally those things are revealed or that tension is broken much later. So I'm wondering why you made the choice to reveal Abby's character's sexuality and show that kind of romantic relationship or break that tension so early and in the pilot.
I think that's a really, really valuable and interesting question that it's worth thinking about for a minute. So, and by the way, for those of you who haven't seen the rest of the show, Max's character is also queer. I always thought that you could sort of 40% of people pick that up from the ending scene where she's like, Carson, Abby's character, is like, I don't know. And she's like, I know. So that is something that we discussed, and as you might expect, there were also like notes and network perspectives on. I think they're developed on TV probably in the 90s, a sort of style of storytelling around queer stories in particular, that was like tease them, right? And don't go there too fast because you don't want to turn people off. So it was like this, like, will they, won't they? And they kind of look at each other, and that's like a payoff after 3 episodes. And we just wanted to be frank about some of what the show was talking about from the start. But also, it was really important to us. You know, we all grew up watching shows that predominantly featured white straight men, for cis men, for most of our lives, right? And you empathize with them, right? And those stories are considered universal. It was really important to us to say, this is a universal story. This is who these people are, but that doesn't make it niche or micro or indie. It's a really fun story about people finding their dreams and who they want to be with. But we wanted to go there quickly, in part to kind of not do that thing that shows sometimes do, where it's like can create a certain kind of rage in queer communities online when shows do that. And at the same time, you know, it's just one part of the story. There's there's a whole variety of different narratives going on in the show, but it's been interesting for me to see how strong the reaction has been to the queer narratives in the show, in positive ways and negative ways, because of, I think, that sort of frankness. Does that make sense?
Hi, my name is Katie, and I absolutely loved watching it. I can't wait to keep watching. I was going to ask, kind of going off of that question, you mentioned earlier kind of having some feedback or like the response to the show that were more negative, people saying, oh, you're wokeifying our American story, that type of criticism. I was wondering kind of how you dealt with that, because I think that's like something that really bothers me out there. And I can't imagine like my creation kind of being under that type of criticism. And I was just wondering how you handle that and your perspective on kind of that discourse over social media.
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. And for those of you that want to be showrunners and directors and writers, like, it's very much like these are just very practical questions that really can shape the response to your work. So I think there's 2 answers to that. One is like my personal reaction to it, and the other one is more of a practical reaction from the perspective of the person who's trying to take care of the show. The first one is, when I make things, you are making them for an audience through yourself as a lens, and in this case through a really strong group of writers as a lens. And then you put them out in the world, and you kind of have to do a little bit of like armoring, where you're like, you know, you've lost all objectivity. By the time the show came out, I'd been working on it for 2.5 years, and I don't think it's perfect. I have tons of notes on the show, but you love it, right? And then you're like, this is gonna be misunderstood, and this is gonna be we knew that it was gonna get caught in a cultural narrative. So for me, my friend Maybell, who came out when we were just starting to put out the show, that was a moment for me, that because when I first got to know her, she like kind of would always talk like this about everything. And like, you know, she hadn't come out to her family. And she'd been with the same woman for 23 years. When she was comfortable enough to say that to a room full of people, in part because she was part of the community that made this show, that was like a moment that I carried with me, where I was like, everything else felt small, if that makes sense. So one thing I would do, especially if you're making things that there is going to be a political reaction, is like, save those moments for yourself. I think the other thing that was really interesting with the trolling, and this is more of a practical perspective, is like, so I have a friend, Gloria Calderon-Kellett, who created One Day at a Time and the show With Love on Amazon, who's like, kind of like we call each other when we're like, what do you do about this? And we had like when the day the show came out, because Amazon has like a customer reviews feature. So the show got posted on a bunch of like sort of, weird, dark internet blogs, and people went and wrote reviews. So for the whole launch weekend, even though the show was at like 100 on Rotten Tomatoes, it was at like 1.1 stars on Amazon. And you think like, oh, people are just going to go there and see that and be like, I don't want to watch this. Like, but it was really interesting talking to her because there's this sort of common sense perspective that's like, don't respond. That's what they're trying to get you to do. And we were talking and we were like, God, that's kind of the advice that our parents gave us about like our bullies in middle school. I don't know. I was bullied in middle school, and my parents were like, just keep walking. And I was like, I'm not sure that's great advice. And why are we doing that now? Like, so she and I and a couple of other showrunners like came together and said a couple things about the Amazon platform and customer reviews and how they were being used. And then we actually got it taken down, which was good because, reviewing a show is not the same as reviewing paper towels. And those are going to get different kinds of responses. So I'm glad that we did that, and we didn't just sort of stay quiet about it on the sort of more practical level. But also, again, for people who are telling stories, queer stories, if you're from a historically marginalized group and you're telling stories, things like this are going to enter every part of your process. It was a huge part of our marketing process, and things happened in our marketing process that we were like, you can't say that. And you have to be ready for that, and you have to be ready to respond to it on a practical level, or your work is going to get misrepresented. Well, we had things in our marketing process, for example, where people were sort of saying like, well, we don't want to show this kiss in the trailer because, it's the data shows it's like off-putting to people. And I was like, they're not going to like the show. And also, like, you can't platform prejudice, anti-queer bias, racism, sexism into marketing materials or creative notes, right? Because testing is also used for creative notes. You can't platform bigotry into that and just say, well, that's people's opinions. And I think, societally, if you look at sort of big data, which is something that has really evolved in the last 20 years, we're still like, relatively speaking, very crude in our ways of sort of filtering it and talking about it. And there have been really significant legal cases about that at Google and other places. And it has a role in our industry too, where a lot of the obstacles that seem so immutable and impossible to change in terms of representation are really coming from testing and data that isn't adequately taking prejudice in the audience into account, if that makes sense. That's like, for example, probably why there's every Latinx show gets canceled and things like that. It's like because they perform differently than the show about nice white family in Chicago, and there should be places for both of those shows in our ecosystem, but right now they get stacked. They get ranked, and the algorithms underneath them just don't recognize that those two shows are going to be viewed differently. It's been really interesting with League of Their Own because the response to it has been great in general, and it has a broad audience, but it also has an incredibly passionate core audience who have like written 8,000 pages of fan fiction and made piles of fan art and all these things that I'm like, whoa. I've never had a show that like had a fandom before. So that's a new experience for me. And that's another thing that like doesn't really get measured in quite the same way. We were lucky with our show, I think, because of the IP underneath it. it didn't get kind of pigeonholed the way that a lot of shows that tackle similar things can. But yeah, it's disturbing when you start to look into that stuff.
Well, I'm sure you benefited from A League of Their Own being being
Yeah.
recognizable. But I think that's really interesting because have you almost exclusively with Amazon? Is that?
No, I worked a lot with FX and HBO, and as a producer, I work tons of places. But Amazon's been kind of my home base, especially because League of Their Own and Daisy Jones and the Six both got disrupted by COVID. So in different ways, I've been making them both for like 3.5 years now. And Amazon's a really great place to work. The intentions of the people who work there are great, and they're trying to make really good things. But it's like a startup that's also the biggest company in the world, if that makes sense. Like they just like started doing TV, and they're kind of applying from a corporate perspective the same principles that they use with everything else. And then obviously our industry is quite different. So it's been really fascinating to watch.
Well, yeah, that was my question. It's like, do you think that the same kind of micromanaging the metadata is that streamers, or is that now industry wide? I mean,
Yeah.
because when you talk about Mad Men, when that show came out, no one was watching it, and everyone was talking about it. Like literally, they would send out
Yeah.
press release if they broke 1 million viewers, and it's like, but it had a huge cultural imprint. So what you're talking about, the fan fiction, that kind of, for a while there, as television was sort of becoming this new thing, they were factoring in the fan fiction and the core, so that it was like, you can't get the big audience anymore. So what you need is a devoted core audience who's going to talk about this and post about it and blog about it and all that stuff. So are you saying that is not true with the streamers, that they're relying exclusively on these like kind of numbers?
Yeah. I mean, you just said about 6 things that I think are super fascinating and really revealing. And these are things that people in our industry don't talk that much about. And honestly, I think it's because a lot of creative people just don't know that much about them. But I've been at Amazon for so long, and I'm nosy and always want to know why things are happening. So I think at the time that streaming started, first of all, now everything's a streamer, right? Because even linear channels and theatrical films are getting fed up into streamers. None of that data is accessible. Like, we can't look at it. You can't look at it. And it's difficult to know the lenses by which that data is being judged or evaluated. Again, I only have gotten some information about them by being super nosy. It is really tricky. Like at the time that streaming started, there were all these articles about like microcasting, and like now we're gonna see shows that like would never have been made before and are gonna reflect different kinds of experiences because now there's more channels and things won't need to be as broad. And I think that sort of happened for a minute, especially at the start of Amazon. I worked on Mozart in the Jungle. I think we had 11 viewers. We won a lot of awards.
I watched Mozart in the Jungle.
No, the show had a really devoted fan base, but it's a show about classical music, right? So it has some what might be called barriers to entry. Transparent, famously also incredibly culturally influential, watched by the same 11 people. And I'm joking, really, a lot of people watched both of those shows. Orange is the New Black, right? So one thing that I have learned, and I'm probably talking out of school more than I should now, is none of those shows succeeded by these metrics. But all of the streamers were at a point that time, in that period of time, where what their priority was acquiring customers, so they needed things to be noisy, right? And then also incentivizing artists to work with them, because people were like, Netflix, like I don't want to make a movie with Netflix, right? And they were like, we want the best filmmakers and the best showrunners to be making those. So they were incentivized to be very receptive to artists, to renew things when they felt important or impactful, and in general to kind of message to the creative community like we're a very good, maybe better place to make stuff if you want to make stuff with integrity. Now the focus of those businesses is on retaining customers. And there's a lot more focus on efficiency, which is sort of a calculation of like the cost per view. You can stop me when this gets incredibly boring. And so if shows are efficient or not, they need to have a certain number of people watching them. That's going to be much easier for certain kinds of shows. So in some ways, it makes you realize ratings are much easier.
Yes.
Because they're transparent and because you're like, well, look, only 5 million people are watching this show, but like it's 5 million people that aren't watching any of our other shows and we're building a night around them or whatever. That kind of transparency doesn't exist anymore. And instead what you have are formulas, right? That because nobody with subscription services, no one can tell you exactly what makes someone keep a subscription. So they all have ways of determining that, and those will have bias in them and questions inside them that are worth exploring the same way that any algorithm does. There's not a lot of bad intentions, but I think one thing I feel is when there's good intentions, but all the people with those good intentions are swimming against a place that culturally doesn't necessarily, I'm not even really talking about Amazon here, that really has no interest in those values. Like, it's really challenging. Yeah. Yay. Darcy? Who plays Greta? Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's Darcy. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so there's a couple different answers to that. The first one is one thing I thought a lot about, that we thought a lot about in shaping the narratives, and in particular, how we were going to do the queer relationship, was exploring this idea of when you grow up in a society where there's not a clear, not a sort of vocal queer community, queer people tend to internalize what the society's giving them. And they do that in two different ways, right? One is that what the society is saying about them is the truth, which is where Abby's character is coming from. And the other is what the society is saying about them is the rules that they have to abide by. And so Greta's character was really shaped from that perspective of like someone who, to me, is heroic, where like she figures out how to get what she wants. And the line that she says about like robbing the bank is like something to me that has a lot of pain underneath it, right? Because you can tell she's been in and out of a lot of different kinds of situations, and she hasn't necessarily stayed any place long, and that's probably because she can't, but she's still having fun, right? Whereas Abby's character Carson is more coming from this place of like, is this okay what I'm feeling? Is this that kind of thing. And those are dynamics that you can see represented in queer cinema and in the history of lesbian relationships on screen. The other answer to it is we'd written this character. Abby and I created the show together. Abby knew that she was going to have to make out a lot with this person. Darcy is one of her best friends. She was like, I think maybe it should be Darcy. I was like, cool. Like, but I think they felt really comfortable with each other. And Darcy has this quality as a person. Those of you who've watched The Good Place, you've seen her work there, where she's like kind of always playing all the angles of a conversation, and she's really fun, and she's sometimes hard to pin down, and she does things that are unexpected. And I think Abby kind of read that quality into Greta and connected the dots, and it's just been a wonderful experience.
Hello. Oh, here. Sorry. Hello, my name is Isabella. Thank you so much for coming today. This is also my first time watching it, and I will also be watching all of it because I think that this was like a really, really good pilot. I was on the edge of my seat, and I wasn't into it. Like, I was turning to her the whole time, and I was like, are they going to kiss? I was like, they're going to kiss. It's going to happen. And then when it happened, I was like, I really enjoyed it, essentially. And I thought you guys did a really good job of like introducing all the characters and establishing the stakes and the wants and the needs. And I'm a screenwriting major, so I'm currently taking a pilot writing class.
Cool.
So I'm writing my first pilot that I'm actually invested in, and I was curious to know what the process of writing this pilot was like, what were the biggest challenges, and what would you say like is the most important thing to take away when writing my own?
Okay, great question. Writing pilots. Very interesting, very challenging, and also something that like you're gonna write twice as many pilots in your life as a TV writer than you are gonna write episode 2s if you're lucky. So it's a good thing to think about. Are you writing a half hour or an hour?
Half hour.
Okay, great. So for this pilot, interestingly, we originally sold this show as a half hour, and then we wrote a half-hour version of the show, and then the story of it is massive, and also half hours exist in a certain budgeting structure, and Amazon was like, this show needs to be an hour. So then we made the pilot of the show, which wound up being the greatest thing that could have happened because it really gave a lot more breadth to the narratives. So this pilot was rewritten several times. Certain parts of it never changed at all. Certain parts of it changed radically over and over and over again. And that to me is like one of the biggest lessons of pilot writing, because I read when I'm staffing a room, I read like 300 pilots, right? And there's a lot that are sort of in the B to B plus range. And you're like, that's good. That's a good script. That's a funny joke. That's a whatever. There's a huge difference between the ones that sort of feel like a B plus and then feel like an A minus, even though that's not a big difference in grades, if that makes sense. So I think going back, doing that extra draft, tightening, punching up, all of that is a huge part of it. And then really listening to the show and listening to the characters. Huge things about pilot writing. Make sure that you're starting the story in the right place. And ask yourself, like, why is this the beginning, especially with half-hour pilots? It's just a thing that happens on every single pilot that, and you get the note way more often than you want to. That's like, shouldn't the end of this pilot be the start of the show? Or, like, isn't this thing really... So spending time before you start writing dialogue or doing anything, just being like, what is the real inciting incident of this show? How does it set these people's lives in motion, and sort of break their status quo, right? And in this case, it's this league and women playing baseball. But there's a couple different answers to that question. I think the other thing with pilots is like, especially half-hour pilots, is just make sure it feels like what you want the show to feel like. Every pilot has to do the work of the first act of a feature, right? It has to introduce everybody and be like, but it also has to do the work of a second act of a feature, which is basically where you're like, and this is what the story is. And that's why it's challenging a lot of the times. In half-hour pilots, the thing that you'll hear the most is like, don't make it a premise pilot, especially from FX that's like written on their wallpaper. A premise pilot is, for people who don't know, a premise pilot is basically a show where, what is the right way of defining a premise pilot? It's a pilot where things change in a huge way, in the way that episode 2 really feels like the first episode of the show in a lot of ways. So like, you know, Bryan Cranston's character in Breaking Bad starts like making meth, things like that. And half-hour pilots, a lot of times people want pilots where you're sort of dropped into the show. So like the pilot of Friends, right? Really, there's a lot of gray area between those two things. But I think so much of the challenge is writing something that's a good beginning that also feels like an episode of what you want the show to feel like, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
More questions? Yes, no? Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been great.